Okay, well, welcome everyone. Thanks for attending this session around writing detectors. My name's Gray. I work in the innovation team here at NTFE, um, and our work is around keeping our colleagues at NTFE up to date with the latest innovations in assessment and more generally. And recently, some of that work led us to a bit of a deep dive into writing detectors. And so this presentation has kind of spun out of that. So I hope you find it useful. We're not quite sure in terms of being interactive. We're not quite sure at the moment whether you can come off camera and ask your questions as we go. But for the time being, please do use the chat to pop in any questions. I'll try and take them as we go through, but there's certainly time at the end as well to pick up on anything. Okay, so this session has come from the decision by JCQ to include writing detectors in their advice and guidance for you when it comes to understanding AI use and misuse. I've just copied the relevant bits of the guidance on the screen here, and you can see that there's sort of two elements I wanted to draw your attention to that JCQ say. The first is that you can use writing detectors tools, and they certainly advise us to do so. And they say actually you should maybe use more than one tool, and I've highlighted that on the screen there, because obviously there are lots available. And the second really important thing they say is make sure you don't only use writing detector tools, and this is a holistic piece of evidence gathering, which includes teachers informing the process and students being part of it too. So like I say, that's where this session has come from. Hopefully in the next half an hour, I'm going to take you through a bit about how writing detectors work, and in particular how they're measured for accuracy. And then I'm going to sort of talk through, I guess, some of the problems with the detectors, and hopefully finishing with what we can do about it. Charmaine's, I know he's already put this in the chat, but you will be getting a copy of these slides, so there's no need to write everything down and do loads of screen grabs because they'll be coming around. Okay, so if we think about writing detectors, how do they work? So if we just take a step back and think about generative AI in general, generative AI, like all AI, is a prediction. And the generative AI that produces text works by predicting what is the most likely next word in a sequence of words, and it puts together a sentence that way. And so what a writing detector can do is match up that likely prediction against what's actually happened and see whether there's a match between those two things. Now, some writing detectors essentially measure that, but do it in the opposite way. In other words, they measure the variation away from that prediction. But essentially, it's the same thing. So we've got a prediction, and we can match. We can look at what's actually happened in real life and see whether there's a match. There are some other elements to writing detection, so it's not just as simple as pattern matching. We've got things within generative AI that are kind of, if you like, signatures of that technology. And it tends to use certain sentence structures or a lack of variation anyway in the sentence structure in terms of the output that it produces. There's certain types of words that are kind of overused in generative AI. You can see some of the examples on the screen. And so all of these kind of elements feed into the writing detection. And the writing detectors do this at sentence level. So they'll look at a sentence and kind of look for the patterns and look for the words and say this sentence and make a decision, make a prediction of whether this sentence is likely to have been written by a human or a computer, and then aggregate that up to a whole piece of text. Sorry, I went too far. Aggregate up to a whole piece of text, and we obviously then end up with a prediction. Is this piece of work likely to be written by computer or person? Now, I'm sure you've seen a lot of these writing detectors in action. You probably use them, and this is just a copy from one of the websites that have one of the free writing detectors. And this is kind of, I'm not sort of picking on these people necessarily, but this is kind of common, the common terminology, if you like, around writing detectors and how they're marketed is that they're really accurate. 99% accuracy we can see on the screen here. This carries on saying, rest assured, you're fully covered with the most comprehensive AI solution. So it kind of leaves you thinking, well, this must be pretty good, and the results that I get must be pretty accurate. I think it even says on the slide here that you get error-free content from some of these other tools within this company's suite of tools. So there's a lot of sort of positivity, I guess, a lot of good vibes around writing detectors when you look at the marketing material. But it's our job, I guess, to dig under that and really understand what these writing detectors are doing, how accurate they are, and so that when we use these in our work, when we talk to students about their work that we might have put through one of these detectors, we understand really what it's telling us. Okay, so in terms of accuracy, there are lots and lots of different ways that you can measure accuracy, and a lot of these tools, one of the complications that I've certainly found when I've tried to put together a very simple table of, okay, which tool is the best, is that everybody uses a different measure, different terminology, and it then becomes really, really hard to compare. And so you can see on the screen here, I've just put some of the different terminology in terms of that I found, sorry, when I was doing my research. There's a combination on here of terms that we can kind of really sort of really easily define until we know what they are. So, for example, false positives is a really easy to identify term. We can really define it, and we know exactly what it is, and it applies across different tools. Something like recall is the same, although we might not immediately know what it is, but we can define it, and we're going to do that today. Some of these, though, like just saying accuracy, like that example that we had on the last slide, is not very clear, and we need to really understand what somebody means by accuracy before we can take it at face value. So I'm going to use, for the next few slides, I'm going to use Turnitin as my example here, and I'm going to focus on these two terms, recall and false positive, which is what Turnitin use. And I'm doing this for two reasons, I guess. One is that Turnitin is the most popular, the most used tool out there. And lots of you probably are using it. You've probably got it switched on your Turnitin service. But secondly, Turnitin are also one of the most transparent tools out there. So they actually have published a white paper that that tells us about the technology that sits behind their tool, and they've published some values linked to these two terms on the screen. So that's why I'm using that one. So let's have a look. Firstly, let's have a look at recall. Recall is defined as essentially a true positive. So what does that mean? It means that if you put in a piece of text that you have that is written by a computer, so you've generated somehow with AI, and you put it through Turnitin's tool, if it correctly labels that as an AI generated piece of text, then that's a successful recall. And so that's one half of the story. The other half of the story is a false positive. So let's just understand this. A positive just means that it's been labeled as AI. So the tool is looking for AI written work. And so a positive result means, yes, we think this is AI written. So that's why it says positive. And in this case, in a false positive case, it's a piece of work that's been actually written by a human, but it's been labeled by the tool as written by AI. So it's an incorrect, or if you like, false positive. Okay, so we're going to delve into this a little bit further then. So in terms of recall, so remember this is AI written text labeled as written by AI, and that would be successful recall. And then there's obviously always going to be some, I guess, error in the system. And so there's always going to be an element of, okay, there'll be some text that's written by a human, but for whatever reason, to do with that first slide that we talked about, how the systems work, it gets a label that it's been written by humans, even though has actually been written by AI. So that's a wrong result. That would actually be called a true negative, sorry, a false negative, but we won't worry about that. We'll leave it as recall for now, or unsuccessful recall. Okay, so sticking with Turnitin in our example, they give us a number for this. Now, it's important that we contextualize this in the with the information given in the white paper that the Turnitin tool can successfully recall 84% of texts where there is a combination of human and AI writing. So if you think of, I guess that's probably what a normal use of generative AI is right now. Is that somebody might produce some text using AI and then edit it themselves, so they're putting their own, putting their own information in amongst the AI generated text. I guess it could be the other way around. It could be that somebody writes a piece of text themselves and asks AI to improve it, enhance it, summarize it, or whatever. So that combination of AI and human writing, Turnitin thinks it can successfully identify the AI elements 84% of the time. Now, on the other side, on the false positive side, you're obviously going to have batches of text that you know are written by humans and become labeled as humans. That's a true negative, by the way, if you're interested. But then you're going to have the opposite of that, a false positive, where you have, like I said, your human written text, but is labeled as AI. And I guess this is obviously a big problem, because what we don't want is a learner who's done all the work themselves, if they put all their effort in, but is being labeled as AI written, and therefore maybe doesn't get the credit for it that they deserve. Now, oh, and by the way, the Turnitin tool is with a few caveats around not including really small bits of text, because that's hard for them to analyze. But once you get over a certain word count, and also once you discount really pieces of work that have really small elements of AI detection in them, and I think the number is 20%. If it's under 20% of the complete piece of work, then those things are discounted out of the system. So as long as you discount those, because they're the really hard things to do, and the sort of major sources of inaccuracies, then Turnitin say that they will have a false positive rate of less than 1%. And what I really want to get across to you is that you need both of these elements to have to understand if you've got a good or a bad writing detector tool. Because when we measure the accuracy of these tools, these two variables on the screen are completely independent of each other, but they're not related to each other. And I fell into the trap, and I made the mistake of thinking, was recalls normally really high? Recalls like 90 something percent, great. False positives often really low, like 1% or 2% or something. And it feels like they're part of the same number, part of the same variable, but they're actually completely separate. And so just to sort of hammer that home, if I tell you how these Turnitin come up with these numbers. So if you imagine they took 500 pieces of text that they knew for certain had been written by AI, and they put those 500 texts through their detector, and they got that 84% successful recall number when you had co-written text, human and AI written text. So those 500 pieces of work have been analyzed like that, and you've got that 84%. On the other side, we've got a totally separate 500 pieces of work that's run through the detector in a totally different, on another day, say, in a different batch. And of those 500 pieces of work that Turnitin know are human written, I hope that they know they're human written, because that's quite a hard thing to know. But anyway, that's a whole nother argument. If they know they're human written, then their tool will, as I said, only incorrectly label that as AI written 1% of the time or less. And so they're two completely independent variables. And what that means is that you can have these two things can change differently with different tools. So you can have, for example, really high recalls, a really good recall, but really poor false positive rate. And you could have the other way around. You can have both of these high, both of them low. So as long as you understand they're separate, they're independent of each other. And so that's why you really need both elements. If you think about it, if you have a really high false positive rate, then lots of learners are being, I guess, wrongly accused of misusing AI in their work, and they're getting an AI label on their work when they've written it. So that's obviously, a really not a good thing. We definitely don't want that. But recall is also important, because if you don't have good recall, then there's lots of people out there potentially using AI or misusing AI in their work and not being labeled as such. And obviously, as we know, learners will talk to each other, and ones that get away with it will probably share with it with their friends, and we don't want that either, you know. So we want high recall, we want low false positive. And so quite often when you look at a tool's website and it gives you a number, it might say, like that first example we had, we're 99% accurate. Then immediately we don't know what it means. We don't know if it's talking about recall. We don't know if it's talking about false positives. What we do know is it's not giving us the whole side of the story. It's not telling us. It's not telling us both of these elements. And then just before I move on to the next section, the last thing I'll say is I said before that Turnitin are the most transparent, and they are. They've given us they published their white paper last year. Even Turnitin haven't, as far as I know anyway, I've never seen publish their recall rate, their successful recall rate of pure AI writing. So if somebody just gets, you know, an answer out of ChatGPT and submits it as their work and doesn't change it, then we don't know. I don't know anyway how likely Turnitin is to recall that as AI written. We only know that co-authored human AI number of 84%. So I guess what I'm saying is even the most transparent tool out there in Turnitin, we still don't know fully all of these numbers to really understand how that's working. Okay, so let's move on then, because there are some other ways we can look to compare tools, and this is one of these ways. In that some people have done some comparison work and published that and said, here's, you know, I've reviewed all of these tools, and here is the answer, if you like. Here's the analysis for you, and we can use that. And so I've got one on the screen here. This comes from a website called Scriber, and this was written last year. And on the face of it, this looks really useful. It looks like we can sort of head towards the top of the list. If we are struggling for finances at college or training provider, wherever you work, you might have to skip to the first free one and see what the accuracy is there and see whether that's appropriate. If you can afford it, you can pay for the non-free one, then great. But you know, you'll obviously want to head to the top of the list and stay away from those at the bottom. However, I do want to kind of unpick this a little bit over the next few minutes because it's maybe not as clear as it looks on first glance. And again, I guess this is part of this session that sort of tells you, please don't just sort of take things at face value. Please dive into them and check out what people are writing about their tools, because a lot of it does come down to the marketing. Okay, so first thing I want to mention is that you might be I'd forgive you for thinking that this accuracy number here is to do with recall, because I've just spent loads of time telling you what recall is, especially as it's next to a false positive column. So you kind of think, well, maybe that's the number. However, it's not recall. It's actually a score that this researcher, Mr. or Mrs. Caulfield, I don't know which, has gone in and given these different tools. And the way they scored it is that if the tool gave them a correct percentage of AI written text within the piece of text that they knew what the answer was, if the tool gave them that to within, I think it was plus or minus 10% of like a relatively narrow range, they gave that a score of 1. If it was accurate but not quite that accurate, so within a bit of a wider range but still giving it the relatively right label, they gave it a score of half. And if it wasn't accurate at all, then they gave it a score of 0. So that accurate, and then obviously when you aggregate all that up, you get an accuracy score out of 100. And so that's quite a different methodology to things like recall and false positives that we just talked about. So just be aware of that. However, I guess it gives you a good understanding of which is a good tool. It just makes it really hard to compare with another person that's done a piece of research or with the tool websites them directly, because the numbers are, you know, you're comparing apples with oranges. It's a completely different thing.
Right.
Hi, Shemaine.
Got a question.
Yeah.
So can I just clarify, is recall only AI generated work that has not been modified by students, or can recall include work that has been AI generated and then adapted and edited by students?
Yeah, so recall as a number is where you have either some or all of the text being generated by AI. The correct recall would be a tool correctly labeling that bit as AI written that has been written by AI. And so in the white paper that Turnitin published for us, they talk about their accuracy when there is a combination of computer, so AI, and human writing within the text. And they said that they're 84% accurate in that context, in that example. So recall is the correct labeling of AI writing as AI. And that can be within a text that's also got some human writing in.
Perfect. Thank you.
Hopefully that answered the question. If it doesn't answer the question, then we'll come back to it at the end, and hopefully I'll explain it a different way.
Thanks.
The second thing I wanted to say about this table is it's out of date almost immediately because these tools are changing, although I've got an interesting update on that on the next slide. But theoretically, it's out of date, and because the tools are changing all the time and learning from the data that you put in. And I'll be honest, I've got this on one of my slides later on. Is my presentation is also out of date as soon as I wrote it, because this world is moving fairly fast. But at least we can understand, hopefully, the theory of writing detectors and know what to look for. And then the last thing I want to point out is the competing interests that lie behind this particular piece of work. Now, I'm going to be totally honest, I only found this by accident. And what I'm going to show you now is just as a pure fluke, really. But it goes to show how difficult it is to separate what is pure research, if that's the right word, from what is marketing. So just have a quick look at the bottom right hand corner and you'll see that I accessed this website early this year in April, and this was presenting to me work done last year by somebody called Caulfield. I then, a couple of weeks later, I had to go and check something, so I went back onto this website and I got this table, which was a slightly different table on the same website. This is literally 2 weeks later. We've got a new author. It's been written this year. And so what it tells us is a few things, actually. One is that it's added two tools to the table, so now are 12 instead of 10. And the ones that have been added are are the number 2 and the number 3. But if you take those out for a minute, every other number on this table is exactly the same. So I would actually question whether this was done in 2024, because all the numbers look like the table was produced in 2023, exactly the same, whether that's accuracy, star rating, etc. And then the other thing that's massively changed is that on the last table, now I can't go back on my Teams, but if you're watching a recording, you can go back and see that the top one was called Winston AI, and it had 84% accuracy and no false positives with a star rating of 4.2. But it's now called Scriber Premium, which so happens to be the website that I found this information on. And so therefore it's hard to take this without thinking, is this a piece of marketing rather than a piece of research? And like I say, I genuinely found this by accident because I had to go back and check something on that table that I wasn't sure about. So there are lots of competing interests out there. Okay, so if we can't use things like those lovely tables to choose a tool, then can we dip into the academic literature maybe? And the answer is yes, slightly. And the information that we get is slightly concerning, but let me just talk you through a couple of them. This is a paper that was written last year, published this year by a research team led by Perkins, as you'll see at the top there. And this piece of research used Turnitin only as its tool, and it only fed into the tool pieces of work that were completely written by AI. So it was feeding in AI work into the tool. And if we come back to our recall definition, therefore we would want recall to be really high. It was only AI writing. There was no kind of human conflicting, not conflicting, but there's no kind of co-writing with a human. And you can see in purple there that it identified, it correctly labeled the AI writing 91% of the submissions. So that gives us an indication as to what Turnitin's recall rate might be. Like I said before, they haven't told us directly in their white paper, but this piece of work gives us an idea that maybe a recall rate for Turnitin is around 91%, or certainly it was in this work. But what's slightly concerning is the next bit of highlighting here, which is that within the text, which remember was 100% written by AI, there was no human written work in this study. Only just over half of the sentence level content was detected as AI, which is obviously pretty low, given that we know 100% of the work was written by AI. So we know that that's a challenge. And if I go on to the next piece of work, which is the same research team publishing a piece of work this year as a preprint, so just a caveat that this hasn't been peer reviewed as far as I know. But we can see here, and sorry to give you the context of this work, the group of researchers looked at 6 different writing detectors, including Turnitin and others. But they also purposefully tried to evade detection using different prompting techniques. So they didn't write any of the words themselves. This is still purely AI written work. But they tried to use evasion techniques within their prompt. So a really easy one to understand is asking generative AI to produce an answer and asking it to include 5 spelling mistakes, please, because spelling mistakes are something that humans do, not people do. Now that's kind of the lowest level, the simplest, if you like, form of evasion that they tried out, and they had lots more complicated ones. But what you can see is that essentially the recall rate has gone down to somewhere between, at best, 40% and at worst 17% when somebody purposefully tries to evade detection using different prompting techniques. And so this is fairly low, way lower than the recall level that we had in sort of previous slides. So this is sort of, I guess, quite concerning. Obviously, we can't look at false positives in this work, in this context, because all of the work that these people are using, all the text, sorry, that these people are using is purely computer generated text. So so that nothing else can be measured, just the recall. Okay, I just want to make another point here that even if you don't use an evasion type prompt, so you don't prompt AI to include things that aren't normal for it to include. You can get around it another way. So I'm just going to play this video. Now there shouldn't be any sound, so I'm just going to talk over this. And you can see what's happening. But essentially, this is a tool that humanizes, what it calls humanizes AI and text. So I've just put in a bit of text. I have asked ChatGPT to tell me how planes work, as if I'm a 10-year-old, I think I asked for it to make it nice and simple. And so you can see here, we've got a little bit of text telling me how planes work, as if I'm a 10-year-old. Now, this particular tool is called Undetectable AI, and it's telling me that of all the free writing detectors, my writing is being detected in the main as written by AI. So you can see I've got the different ones here. GPT-0 has got a yellow, OpenAI has got a green, which is a bit concerning because we know that this is written by AI content. Quite a lot of them are saying that there is around 50% of human and 50% AI detected in here when we know it's 100%. So that's quite concerning initially. But the point of this little bit of the presentation is to show you that if I go onto this service and I press that humanize button, which I've just done, it apparently, according to what we're seeing here, gets around that problem of a writing detector, a problem for a learner of a writing detector, calling them out, if you like, for using AI. And so what it's done is it's used the known kind of structures of generative AI and the lack of variance and the particular words it's used. It's changed those things to try and make it sound more human. And you'll see on the video, I'm going to put in the answer back through the system. Now I'm using a free trial version of this. As far as I know, the paid for version is the same technology. I don't know that it's any different. And what you'll see here is that apparently, according to this website anyway, that I've taken that piece of text that, remember, was 100% written by AI, and it's telling me now, according to these writing detectors anyway, that it's human. And so what we end up with is a situation whereby even if you have a good writing detector, it seems like at the moment anyway, you can either use evasion techniques in your prompts, or you can use a service like that video I just showed you, and you can maybe get around the writing detection. Okay, we're coming towards the end, but I just wanted to put in 2 final recommendations from AOC before we sort of start to wrap things up. And sorry, from JISC, I meant, before we wrap things up. So this is a blog by this is from a blog by Michael Webb, who works at JISC in their AI team. Really brilliant advice that JISC give on AI. If you haven't sort of come across their work, then definitely have a look. And this is what Michael is saying, and I wanted to sort of point out the bottom bullet point on this slide, which is linked to, I think, to what a couple of people have said in terms of, is this AI human writing together? This is the fact that a student can hand in work that has some AI assistance to it is becoming the norm. We know it is, and so it's how it sort of makes us think, well, what are we trying to detect using a writing detector when we know that there's some kind of combination of humans working alongside AI to produce a good piece of work. And the second thing I wanted to point out, again from JISC, again from Michael Webb's writings, and in this case, this was the JISC and joint AOC principles that were published a few months ago. And I've highlighted at the bottom there that, and this is the first time I've ever seen the notion written about that actually to use a writing detector, you need some training and guidance. You shouldn't just be left free to use a writing detector, even Turnitin. You should have some training to really understand what the outputs mean and therefore, and what the limitations of that prediction is that you're getting from the writing detector. Okay, so just a few other talking points then, just to sort of try and summarize the problems with writing detectors, and then I have promised you I've got one slide on the solution. So a few of the other issues are around the lack of transparency in these detectors. A lot of them are free tools. Even the Turnitin tool, as I'm told, doesn't give you their sort of workings for what for why they've labeled a sentence or a piece of work as AI or human written. So there is some lack of transparency in these tools, and in particular, the free versions will not give you that transparency, and that's I guess for a reason. It's because there's other reasons why those tools are being given for free, and it's about grabbing that data and grabbing that text and using it for other purposes. So really, the detection of AI writing is almost a side part of that show. We've already mentioned this point around mixed computer and human writing is much harder to detect, as we've already seen, and is becoming the norm. I've shown you that video of the undetectable AI that can paraphrase my AI work to make it sound less AI, so that makes them less effective. I've already mentioned that these things are out of date really quickly, so it's hard to keep up. I got a couple of other points, is that these detectors, including Turnitin as a paid for or other paid for detectors, they've actually been banned by some organisations. So I've just put Leeds University as an example on the screen, but they're not the only one. But if you did want to click on that link to Leeds University, it has some guidance for staff to do not use these detectors. And there's two reasons for that, I guess. One is that some of the issues that we've dealt with in this presentation, linked to the second point here around that writing detector standing up within a kind of an appeal system. If a learner was to appeal their kind of any kind of decision on their work. And the other reason some organizations ban these detectors is because they are essentially data grabbers. Certainly the free ones are data and text grabbers, and so you're essentially putting in learner work and learners' intellectual property and giving it away, and that's obviously a bit of an issue as well. This point, I think, is possibly one of the most important points of these whole slides, which is if you do use these writing detectors, paid for or not, there is some circumstantial evidence that some particular groups of students are possibly or are likely to be discriminated against because of how they write. So on the screen here, I've got examples of people who use English as a second language and people who are neurodiverse, because it's sometimes the case that those individuals within those groups use a different writing structure and style, which is more formal, which is less varied, and therefore a detector might think is more likely to be AI than human, because that's how they write, that's how they communicate. And I've already made the point that if you maybe know how to try and evade detection, or you pay for something like ChatGPT 4.0, then you might find that you get an output that is more likely to and to not be detected as AI written, even if it is. There are some other detection methods being developed. Was one using a kind of linguistic approach that looks at the language rather than the variants and the structure. And you know that might be a good approach, but to be honest, that's early days for these, so we don't have any kind of working examples that we can use. It's all at the moment it's sort of a theoretical approach, but at least that would, taking a linguistic approach, at least gives you a really good starting point for a discussion with your student about the language choices they're making, because it's almost automatically transparent. You can see and talk about the language choices. There's no kind of statistical prediction behind it. And then the last point I'll make in this section is, just because a writing detector isn't perfect, it doesn't automatically mean we shouldn't use them, I guess. So it comes down to what's sort of the best thing to do in this situation. We might know that something isn't perfect, but we might still want to use it as long as we apply the right caveats. Okay, so I've spent 20 or so slides talking about the problem with writing detectors. I've got one slide of the answer, and I'm going to sort of spoiler alert here. There's nothing kind of massively new on this slide, I'm afraid. I haven't got like a magic one that I can give you. But there's a few things that I think you should take away with you. And the first one is exactly where we started. Please don't rely on a writing detector, or even two, to be your sole arbiter or arbiters of this decision. It's one of many tools that you'll need to use, including comparison with other work, including a conversation with the learner, potentially including some further assessment. It's clear to all of us in education that the people that most know the learners are teachers, so they should have a really strong voice in this process, and their kind of their input is obviously really important. I think that if your organization is going to use a writing detector, and come back to the beginning, that is what JTQ tell us we should be doing, then I think that's okay, but it would be better almost to control that use of a writing detector with a kind of hit squad, if you like, of really well trained people that understand what the lengths you can go to interpret the outcomes of a writing detector, so they can put the right caveats on it, and they can put the right understanding that this is a prediction. This isn't anything definite. This is a prediction of what we think based on patterns and variants and structure, and that kind of thing. And so that then informs the next steps for the process. And then sort of, I guess the bigger picture is, how can we kind of avoid getting ourselves in this hole? Well, one way is to use a much bigger range of assessment methods. Now, we know that generative AI can create presentations, can create images, can create videos. So there are essentially ways around this as well. But it's certainly harder to link, say, a piece of text and a video on similar learning outcomes. It's harder to do that at the moment, if you're a learner just using generative AI rather than putting your own thoughts and efforts into it. And then the last point is around contextualizing assessment. So really trying to draw on individuals' experience of life, of maybe their placement, maybe putting in a case study, so that you're really forcing someone to understand the context rather than just the knowledge that you're assessing. And or, as it says there, using a measure of the process as well as the outcome. So asking people to submit drafts, asking people to do a planning session within their lesson in the presence of a teacher, that kind of thing, and get those things submitted. Ask people to submit how, in their acknowledgement section at the end, how they might have used generative AI to form that piece of work, and come to a judgment on whether that's appropriate use or misuse. Okay, so that's the end of my presentation. I've just had a look through it. I think there might only be one question to sort of answer now. I think the others might have been answered or just be comments. But the very last comment from Melanie is around the parameters which you can change within Turnitin. And the honest answer, Melanie, I'm really sorry, but I don't know. I don't know what can be changed. As my understanding of or my knowledge of Turnitin comes from their white paper, like I say, which was published last year and talks about the accuracy. But I don't know any more about the settings, so I'm really sorry, but I can't help you with that one. So Mina has asked, which detector would you recommend as an AO? So I'll come back, I guess I come back to the last slide, which is please don't use one detector because they all have issues. So don't use only one. And even the one, like I said, that we know the most about, i.e. the one that is the most transparent in its marketing, which is Turnitin, we know that it's definitely not a perfect system. I guess we wouldn't expect it to be perfect. So when you use these detectors, it's really important that you don't just use these detectors, that you use them to inform a wider process and a wider investigation into potential misuse by a student. And I think the more that we start talking about what is use and what is misuse and how to understand the difference between those, the more we start teaching that to learners, the more we encourage learners in their work to acknowledge how they're using, if and how they're using a generative AI to support, support building that piece of work up, then I think we'll get to the point at some point soon. We'll get to a point where we've got a better understanding of what is use and what is misuse, and how to acknowledge it, and therefore we might need these writing detectors less, I guess, than we may be relying on at the moment.
Annie else put a question in. Can you see that one?
Yeah, I'm just reading it now. Live digital assessment. So I just read it out, and I'm reading this live, so apologies. Some employers may have AI built into their equipment. Are there any signs of detecting this other than typical that we know about? No, not that I know of. I mean, I can only really talk about our systems. What if you're using, if you're if a learner is in one of our online assessments, then there are safeguards built into that tool that says, that sort of flags up that a learner is using, for example, Grammarly, and using particular known AI tools. And the system, the screen will stop and freeze, if you like, for that individual if it detects that. But I have to say, it will only detect known things that we know about, or things that our exam platform supplier know about. And there are almost certainly other things that we don't yet know about that aren't built in. So I think that comes back to old-fashioned invigilation and being able to look at a screen, which, I understand you can't have your eyes on one screen all the time. But yeah, I think hopefully Danielle have answered that, even if it's not an easy answer. Kathy's asking, can learners put their own work through? Yeah, absolutely. Nearly all of the detectors, as you saw in that table, are a free service, and so anybody can access it, put their work through. The undetectable AI service that I showed you is a paid for service, apart from the free trial that I used. So only learners that pay for that can use that. But yeah, absolutely, anyone can do it. Now, we should be teaching our learners, and this is a really important learning point actually, why would a website go to the effort of writing a detecting tool and then giving it away for free? And the answer is that website, the company behind that website, they want that text. They want to commoditize that text in some way to train their own large language model, to do something else with it. I'm not sure, but that's why they're grabbing that text. So if a learner does put their work in, they're essentially a commodity, and they should be aware of that. Even if they want to do it still, that's fine, but they should be aware of that. Right, I can't see any more questions. I can't see any hands up. So I think we might be drawing to a close there.